Ivil Antagonist has everything a woman could want. Power enough to blanket out suns and turn worlds into molten hells, a fleet of warships at her command, and the fear of an entire spacefaring nation. But she's silently growing tired of being at the top. There is no place more lonely for someone who has killed all of the competition, and she knows that it will be impossible to find an equal. And so, Ivil Antagonist takes a great risk, asking a powerful oracle a simple question: where can I find true love? Chapter 1, Ivil Antagonist. The Imperial Navy's officer uniform was meant to remind people that the Imperial Navy was not something you should fuck with. The Imperial Navy's uniform was gray. No fun. Gunmetal. The kind of gray that reminded people of freshly poured concrete. It had that kind of texture too. Callous, abrasive, utilitarian. The Imperial Navy's uniform was made of a synthetic fiber weave. A square meter of it cost as much as a conscript made in a year. It could stop an explosive rifle round like a fly off a windshield. The kid wearing the suit would be pulped. Bones smashed, organs ruptured. But the uniform, crisp as the day it was vat-printed. The Imperial Navy liked its officers. Gave them medals for passing basic. A second lieutenant had a strip of them across his breast. An admiral had more tinsel than an old Earth Christmas tree. Wipe your ass well. That's a medal. The Imperial Navy uniform Ivil Antagonist wore was custom. That was against regulations. Regulations were sacrosanct in the Imperial Navy. No one had the balls to tell her that she couldn't, because sacrosanct only protected that which was holy. Ivil Antagonist made doing the unholy her life's mission. Her uniform was black. Gray was the color of bureaucrats. Ivil Antagonist had once dropped a tungsten rod from low Earth orbit through a bureaucrat and the 76 floors of skyscraper beneath him. She didn't do paperwork, she left trails of it in her wake. Her uniform was the pitch darkness of empty space. It was the color of places where stars went to die. No one knew what it was made of. No one asked. There was a single pin on her chest. It wasn't a medal. She hid medals. They were in a case in her room that required 4 Marines in exo-armor to lift. The pin was a small circle with 2 wings coming off of it. They'd been silver once, but time had rubbed the shine off, revealed the tin under the shiny paint. It was the pin given to nouveau Kyries, back when they were all ritz and glamour. Most of them didn't live to be old enough to buy a drink. Ivil Antagonist was 36 years old and felt like she was 70. She waited for just a split second before an armored bulkhead. The systems connected to the door noticed her, then the powerful AI controlling the door weighed its options. It wasn't meant to open the bulkhead door. There were several dozen protocols it was designed to follow that said, in black and white, that the door must remain closed. It weighed this against the very real possibility that the door wouldn't survive contact with Ivil Antagonist's frustration. The door hissed open. Ivil stepped onto the bridge of the Imperial Star Dreadnought Purgatorial Oblivion. Only 10 Imperial Star Dreadnoughts were ever commissioned, and of those, only 3 were actually built. 3 was all the Imperial Navy needed to remind everyone in the system that they shouldn't be messed with. The average Earth-made warship was a workhorse. It was a 20th century pickup with the fat tires and an up-tuned engine. Next to them, an Imperial Dreadnought was a 20th century supertanker. The bridge was laid out like a giant ring, console and command areas pressed up against the edges with a raised platform in the center for the officer in command of the ship to watch over their crew. It was a panopticon of control where one person could keep an eye on the entire command infrastructure of a ship able to go toe-to-toe with entire navies on its own. Ivil walked up the steps to the center of the command plinth. At the moment, the bridge was quiet except for the occasional groan or gasping breath. The officers were pressed into their seats, sinking into gel pads while machines pumped their blood for them. A large navigation screen showed that at the moment the Purgatorial Oblivion's crew was experiencing balmy 7 gravities and would be experiencing those for another 20 minutes as they slowed down on their way to Hamia. "How are things going, Admiral Vestry?" Ivil asked as she came to stand next to the Admiral's crash throne. "HRRR," the Admiral replied. Ivil raised an eyebrow and looked down at the man who was struggling to keep his eyes open against the weight of his eyelids. A spurt of liquid shot through the plastic artery connected to the Admiral's neck. Enough painkillers to give the horse a high that would last a week, and the kind of drug cocktail that would make the average tweaker shit themselves with envy. The crash after the dose was spent would make the average person's life a living hell for a few days, but there were even more drugs to deal with that. The Admiral cleared their throat. "All is well, ma'am," he said. "Hamia is within scanning range." Ivil nodded sharply, then wandered over to one of the consoles to look over the shoulder of the lieutenant in charge of navigation. She moved some hair out of her face with a casual swipe while the brave lieutenant fought to keep conscious next to her. Hamia was a pitiful excuse for a dwarf planet. It was way out in the fringes of the Sol system, well into the Kuiper belt. It had no strategic value. It had no natural resources that weren't better found elsewhere. Its moons were a little better than some captured asteroids, and it was weeks distant from anyone or anything of interest. That made it the perfect home for the lunatics. There were 3 large habitat bubbles poking out of the planetoid surface within a kilometer of each other. They were partially protected by a large crater wall. The Purgatorial Oblivion sensor suite was painting targets as quickly as it could spot them, and that meant that the screen Ivil was looking at was filled with several hundred contacts. Large freighters, pleasure barges, transportation ships, warships. The lunatics had a thriving little community out here, and all of it was moving away from them like fish spooked by a shark. The crowning jewel of the lunatic fleet hovered above the largest of the habitation domes. The Paradoxical. It was as long as a full-on Earth Alliance cruiser, and twice as fat. Even that bulk only made it half the size of the Purgatorial Oblivion. "Have we been cleared for landing?" she asked as she straightened up. No one answered her for a moment, then one of the officers strained to sit up straighter. "And not yet, ma'am," she said. "There might not be enough room." Ivil frowned. That was unfortunately possible. The Purgatorial Oblivion had its own personal berth in Mars orbit. In a pinch, it could use a supertanker's space to load and unload materials, but that was a chore. The lunatics wouldn't have anything to handle her. "I'll be heading out in one of our smaller ships, then," Ivil decided before she spun on a heel and walked out. With the ship undergoing enough stress to pulp an orange under its own mass, the onboard elevators and trolleys weren't active. The grand halls of the Imperial warship were devoid of crew, passenger, or soldier. Anyone that hadn't made it to their crash seat, and there was always one, would either be dead or wishing they were. Ivil walked through the lonely corridors with her head held high. She considered stopping in her suite on board the Dreadnought to freshen up, but dismissed the idea. It would eat up too much time. Ivil did not rush. Instead, she walked through the ship at a calm, reasonable pace until she made it to one of the hangars. 14 fully armed and operational Imperial Angel-class frigates were sitting in locked berths within the Purgatorial Oblivion's belly. Enough ships to form a complete naval battle line, or to blockade a small planetoid. She walked past the first 2, then paused at the third. The Lucky Despot. She had never seen, nor heard, of this particular ship before, but the name amused her. The captain might have had a sense of humor, which was a unique thing indeed within the Imperial Navy. The entire ship groaned in relief as the pressure it was under subsided bit by bit. They were no longer burning hard to slow down, which meant that they were only hours from their destination. Soon, soldiers would be stumbling out of their couches, engineers would be running around looking for damage, and the Purgatorial Oblivion would be brought to full battle readiness. Ivil suspected that bringing an Imperial dreadnought to visit some space clowns might have been a little much as far as shows of force went. It was bringing a nuke to a knife fight. But it might just get her the respect that her name lacked, and she would need all the clout she could manage. In a few hours, if everything went well, Ivil Antagonist would be face to face with one of the solar system's most dreaded adversaries. Claire, the cosmic clown of clairvoyance and C-class Valkyrie of the Lunatics. Chapter 2, The Lunatics. Everyone knew that the Lunatics had a spree up to their eyeballs and nuts of pure titanium. They lived one mistake away from certain death, far from anyone and anything important. and were the last bastion of the disenfranchised, the lonely, and the functionally unhinged. The lunatics' standard operating procedures were a mystery to every war-capable nation in the solar system, most of all to themselves, and it meant that no one, not the Earth Alliance fleets, not the Empire of Mars, not even the space pirates of Ceres, wanted to fuck with them. There was everything to lose, and only 100-year-old clown paraphernalia to win. Every culture across the solar system gained a quirk or two over time. The lunatics went to the quirk dispensary with a 5-gallon drum and loaded up on them until it was full to the brim. They reveled in being a few pennies short of $1, and it showed in everything they did. Their ships weren't just ancient scroff heaps abandoned and stolen from other nations. They were ancient scroff heaps painted in garish colors, covered in dazzle camouflage, then modded until the base ship was unrecognizable. No one needed a glowing red nose on the end of a destroyer. The lunatic did it anyway. Then they slapped on 7 different turret hardpoints in places they didn't belong, one short circuit away from blowing chunks out of their neighboring ships, and they called it art. It hadn't always been that way. In fact, the lunatics could trace their origins back to one of the first off-Earth colonies, a joint France-Canada-Britain lunar colony on the sunny side of Earth's girthiest satellite. The Lunar High Module colony was built like a sea of large bubbly capsules on the lunar surface. They looked like a swarm of ticks stuck to the moon's surface, which earned them the name they wore to this day. When shit went haywire and the first solar system war started, the lunatics left the moon and fucked off to Haumea. The clown stuff didn't start until a few years later. As it turned out, scrubbing and rescrubbing oxygen was a thankless job. It was a lot easier to do if everyone would just wear some damned respirators so that their mouth bacteria would stay in one place. Hence, an entire cargo container full of cheap, Chinese-made, low-danger environmental protection masks. They even worked. Problem was, the masks were a large white oval with 2 glass circles for the eyes and nothing else. It turned the entire fledgling colony into blank-faced freaks living out in the S-end of the solar system during a full-scale intra-system war. Culture has a way to spring up from that kind of thing. Soon, people were painting their masks, and the lunatics had new faces to show the world. Ivil Antagonist was aware of all of this, most of it through cultural osmosis. She wouldn't admit it to anyone, but she had a secret fascination with Earth-made soap operas, which frequently romanticized the lunatics as handsome devils with hearts of gold and a few roguishly rough edges that could be won over by a kind-hearted and beautiful B-movie starlet. She had met a few lunatics away from their dwarf planet home, and they'd all failed to be handsome roguish people with a few rough edges and were a lot more likely to be insane, angry nut-job anarchists with a chip on their shoulder and too much makeup. The frigate, the Lucky Despot, shook as it was freed from its mooring links. So far, the officers on the ship's bridge were quiet and professional. Ivil could tell that the captain was sweating under her finely tailored uniform, but at least she was taking things seriously. She checked and double-checked every security measure and had her crew on alertness level orange, as if she was about to navigate through an active minefield next to a raging space battle instead of just a simple A-to-B transition from the purgatorial oblivion to the waiting paradoxical. Ivil felt the weightlessness trying to pull her off the deck. She frowned and put a stop to that, the heels of her boots clunking down. "Do we have any TA, Captain?" she asked. The captain glanced up, then shook her head. "Not yet, ma'am. Forgive me, but we haven't received confirmation from the paradoxical." In their defense, "We didn't tell them that we'd be coming," Ivil said. The captain blinked. "We didn't, ma'am. I imagine they saw us coming. Just fly towards their capital ship, keep your guns pointed away from anything important, and they'll eventually acquiesce." The captain nodded slowly, then returned to her duties. Operating any warship, even an advanced Imperial warship, was a thankless, complicated job. The Lucky Despot fired its maneuvering thrusters, sliding away from the massive bulk of the purgatorial oblivion and deeper into empty space. The frigate rotated on its central axis while the crew clung on, then it aimed towards Haumea and the lunatic fleet. A burst of thrust later and they were gliding at just shy of 2 g of constant acceleration towards the fleet. Ivil glanced at the ETA on the navigator's screen. They had an hour until they flipped and started a slow-down burn, then another 2 hours before they were close enough to start any sort of docking maneuvers. The captain was playing it safe, moving slower than she needed to, and more cautiously. That was fine. The caution would be noted. The fact that the Imperial Navy hadn't blasted the lunatics' entire fleet into a cloud of debris was a good enough sign that they weren't here to fight. Ivil was considering finding a seat for herself when she felt a faint buzz at her waist. Sighing, she tugged her pager from her belt and glanced at its screen. Meeting with boarding party, scrolled across. Ivil spun on a heel and walked out of the frigate's command center. She slipped into an elevator and rode it up a few floors. Then she stepped out onto one of the topmost floors of the ship. Imperial ships were all long and narrow, but unlike Earth Alliance vessels, they were built vertically. The top of an Imperial ship was the floor of most other navies' vessels. That was just a normal evolutionary change that happened when one's entire navy was built in zero-G by people who'd been born and raised in low gravity. Earth-built ships were still designed by people that were born with dirt underfoot. This being the topmost floor meant that the foot-thick windows built into the ceiling gave her a fantastic view of Hamia and the lunatic fleet. Her attention only lingered on the ceiling for a moment before she took in the rest of the room. This was the space that would be hit first in any attack that broke through the ship's shields, so the room was little more than a luxurious lounge, a space for the crew to relax. At the moment there was no one relaxing at all. The couches and seats, entertainment systems and small cafeteria were all unused. The people in this room, 10 in all, were standing at attention to one side, hands closed as fists over their hearts and eyes staring out into the distance. Ivil looked them over. There were 7 women, 3 men, all on the younger side, though they were all adults. They wore tightly fit spacesuits with armored panels worked over them. They were all Valkyries, which meant, of course, that they weren't entirely human, not anymore. She saw arms made of interlocking metal, eyes that were pitch-black orbs, some had metallic hair, and one of them had a set of skeletal wings folded close against her back. At a glance, Ivil judged most of them to be C-classers. The kind of people that could probably wipe out a platoon of the Empire's best and who would be the front line in any grand conflict. One of them stood out from the rest. She was a shorter woman, or was trying very hard to remain that way. Her armor writhed, and on occasion she would appear several centimeters to the side of where she was, then flick back. She was utterly silent. No breathing noises. No heartbeat. No grinding of metal on metal or squelching of organic parts. Her face was a doll's, a perfectly beautiful piece of metal, carved to appear feminine and pretty, with very real and organic eyes filling the sockets. "Are you in charge?" Ivil asked her. The shorter woman nodded. "Yes ma'am, B-class Imperial Valkyrie, Sonic Spectre, ma'am." Ivil narrowed her eyes. "Oh. I think I've heard of you," she said. "You were the lead of a strike force in series a few years ago." "Yes ma'am," the Valkyrie said. "That's when I earned my 100th corps, ma'am." Ivil nodded. The Empire might have had some of the best tech in the solar system, but they didn't have quite as many Valkyries as some of the other nations out there. The various nations around Jupiter were rich in Valkyries, and Earth had claimed a fair number of them over the first century of space travel. Mars was behind, but they made up for it with quality. No one had more A-classers than they did, and it showed whenever push came to shove. "I presume that your team will be my escort?" Ivil asked. "If you love us, ma'am," Sonic Spectre said. Ivil shrugged languidly. "I suppose there's no harm. It'll reassure the brass, at least. Do we have any idea how many cores the lunatics have?" "Enough to cause trouble, ma'am," Sonic replied. Ivil grinned. "Good answer." Chapter 3, War Clowns. The lunatic war clown belonged to an elite order of space warriors. They weren't the best equipped, they weren't the best trained, they weren't the most decorated of combat troops, they weren't the most fearsome. Instead, the war clown was the least predictable of all warriors. They prided themselves on having no real chain of command, except the chain that whipped new recruits into line when things didn't go according to their lack of plans. Fighting them was begging for chaos. There was no tactic that went unexplored, no harebrained scheme that wasn't schemed, and no way to predict what they would do next. To the regimented and stalwart Imperial Valkyrie, the worst opponent they could face was one too stupid to follow their carefully prepared combat plans, and the average lunatic war clown definitely fit. When a war clown gets their nose, they are also given a corps. The lunatic fleet has, as far as the Imperial Navy can tell, 7,322 corps. The Imperial Navy has a few individuals who, alone, hold more corps within themselves. But the Imperial Navy does not hand out corps to every soldier. Instead, each one of their Imperial Valkyries is a trained, disciplined, and proven soldier. They earn the corps and the power that comes with it. Each corps holds both potential and power. The first ever used by humanity turned astronaut Linda Alvarez's left lung into a machine while she was still on the moon's surface. Humanity later learned that that was a rather tame result, all things considered. A corps always changed something about the person that used it, it always made them different. Giving one to each war clown turned them into an army of fierce, dedicated warriors with an array of unpredictable, dangerous abilities. An army of insane freaks the average Imperial Navy grunt could deal with. An army of insane freaks who might have laser eyes, or breath fire, or shrug off bullets? That was another thing entirely. There was a certain quality to insanity, and the lunatics leaned into it hard. So when Ivil's escort frigate linked up with the Paradoxical high above the surface of Humia and passed the entirety of the lunatic fleet, she was expecting to meet the sort of problems that she wouldn't expect. She noted that Sonic Spectre was looking rather tense. In fact, her entire squadron of Valkyries were looking tense. This was, in essence, a push into enemy territory. The squad had no workable intel. They were escorting a VIP. A VIP known to have very little concern about collateral damage. Worst of all, they were about to meet with some lunatics. Nervous ones. Airlocks opened with a hiss, and Ivil Antagonist started forward without a care. The Imperial Valkyries jumped, but started after her a moment later. They kept information, guns trained on the ground, eyes scanning ahead. The last of the Lucky Despot's airlock doors opened a moment after the first shut behind them. It opened to the exterior airlock of the Paradoxical. There was a large, upside-down smiley face crudely painted across the entire door. It hissed aside, revealing a second door. It too was painted, this time as a large face with a flattened mouth. Ivil and her escort started forwards again. The air took on a new quality, the particular stink of oft-recycled oxygen. The first door shut, the middle one opened. The last had a giant frowny face painted on it, with eyes drawn into a glare. "How inviting," Ivil commented. "Eyes forward," Sonic Spectre told her squad. It was an unneeded order. The door opened, allowing Ivil to step out and take 5 long steps into a large room before anyone could register her movement. The approach caused the people waiting for her to back up a few paces, breaking their neat little welcoming formation. War clowns. Ivil Antagonist swept her eyes across the room. It was a lounge area, with barricades welded to the floors and ceilings. The Paradoxical had once been an Earth Alliance ship, and it showed in its stylings. It was built like a seagoing vessel, then only retroactively redesigned to accommodate life in zero-G. It had been redesigned by the lunatics. More armored half-walls, more automated turrets, more couches, large-screen televisions, and entertainment suites. She noted 2 large anti-tank guns set to either side with overlapping fields of fire, and 26 war clowns. Some were C-class. Likely the best of the best they could muster on such short notice. They were men and women in neon clothes. Poofy skirts, large puffed-out sleeves, face masks with checkered and diamond and swirling patterns. They had guns. Plasma rifles, rail guns, traditional kinetic weapons. Some were Imperial. "Well?" Ivil Antagonist asked. "Do you have any questions? Comments? Please, I'm nothing if not open to discussion." "Who the fuck do you think you are?" one of the war clowns asked. He was large. A C-classer, so one of their best. He was hanging in the air, large metallic tentacles, painted in blue and red, reaching out from his back towards the ceiling and floor to keep him pinned in place. Some Imperial's whore, here to donate her chorus to Dash. His head disappeared. It was empty to begin with. Enough from you, Ivil said. She turned her attention to the next C-classer. What about you? Are you any more polite? This C-classer was a thin, reedy woman. She had 4 eyes. All organic. 2 were growing from stalks on the sides of a head that was a little elongated. Her mask was obviously customized to fit. I'm Snickers. War Clown of the Paradoxical. Can you identify yourself? Snickers glanced over at the headless body currently emptying itself out in the ship's zero-G environment. The blood was slowly pooling up towards a vent in the ceiling. Please? Ivil nodded. I'm Ivil Antagonist, she said. This squadron is here to keep the brass informed of my movements and fetch things for me. She gestured vaguely to the squad behind her. There was recognition at the name. A frisson of terror that circulated around the room. Snickers shifted, lowering her gun as if she knew it wouldn't be of any use. The war clown nodded, then she looked at the corpse. The long tentacle arms were slowly breaking apart, metal folding into metal, a decreasing Fibonacci pattern that was entirely impossible to follow. Soon, 24 small spheres were floating away from the dead war clown. Did you want his cores? It's your kill, Snickers asked. Ivil could sense the displeasure at the question from the other war clowns. It was giving away their limited cores. If she was here to fight and kill, then she'd take them. And all the rest of the cores in their little fleet besides. But she wasn't. Keep them, Ivil said dismissively. What's a dozen more cores, at this point? Just bring me to your ringleaders. The war clowns looked to one another for a moment, then it seemed like a consensus was reached. Ivil usually got her way. It didn't surprise her that the methods she used in the Empire, the overwhelming capacity for violence, worked just as well with the lunatics. I'll bring you to Circus, Snickers said. Circus? Not the Oracle? Ivil asked as she started to walk after the young clown. Snickers spun around, twisting her body at the middle so that she could kick off one of the half-walls to send herself flying towards a corridor. The other war clowns cleared out, but they hadn't received any orders not to follow. Not that they did orders in any case. Ivil's squadron followed after her. They had magnetic boots that secured them to the floor and gave them a strange, halting gait, all except Sonic Spectre, who vanished and reappeared ahead a few feet in a constant stop-go motion. Ivil walked as if she was on Earth. Her uniform acted the same way, because it would have embarrassed her if it did not, and it knew better than to act up. Captain Circus is the Paradoxical's captain, Snickers said over her shoulder. She'll know what to do. The clairvoyant is. She does her own thing. She's a little more independent than most people like. The fact that a lunatic seemed to think that someone was too independent wasn't lost on Ivil. Oh well. I have all day, Ivil said. She continued to follow an increasingly nervous Snickers through the halls of the ship and through multiple bulkhead doors. The Paradoxical opened up a few passages in, and Ivil craned her head back to take it in. The ship might have been much smaller than an Imperial Star Dreadnought, but it was still one of the largest vessels created in the last century, and while the lunatics had turned it into their home, it still had some of its old luxury under the garish paint, banners, and posters. I'm looking forward to meeting this Captain Circus of yours, Ivil said. Chapter 4, The Paradoxical. The Paradoxical had enough room to house 10,000 people. Not well. They'd be crammed into boxes like wage slaves in a corpo home on Earth, only without the comfort of gravity. The ship had started its life as the Paradise. A cruise ship the likes of which the solar system had never seen. It was meant to have a crew of 2,000, and room enough for 5,000 passengers. That was before it was stolen. The ship had been taken near the start of the Third Intrasystem War. It was being used as a non-combatant hospital ship. At least, that's what it claimed. In reality it had become a hidey hole for some of the system's ultra-rich, a place where they could sit back and watch the explosions from afar. The same ultra-rich failed to pay the lunatics for some of their mercenary work. Most of them were tossed out of an airlock before the cruise ship was flown out to the edge of the system. The renamed Paradoxical had turned from a pleasure barge into the home of the angriest clowns in the solar system. The name fit. The suspended infinity pools had been retrofitted into water purification systems. The multiple decks had been modified to hold dozens of turrets ripped out of derelict warships. Some of the larger ballrooms had been converted into missile silos, and the exterior was now covered in ablative armor and several hundred tons of garish paint. The Paradoxical had enough guns on it to take on a full Mars patrol fleet and enough war clowns to give a platoon of Marines pause. Unlike a proper warship, the Paradoxical unloaded its power though stolen, misunderstood, and poorly installed tech. There was no predicting what it would fling at you next. Fortunately, every fight the Paradoxical had been in had been against pirates and thugs that bit off more than they could chew. It had still gained a Republican across the system. There were little people with poor posture and poor eyesight who spent too much time on the extranet arguing about which ship could win in a fight. Massive warships like the Imperial Star Dreadnoughts were usually banned from those discussions. They weren't fair. The Paradoxical was a fan favorite of people who would be lucky to never see the warship. Ivil found herself growing somewhat tense as she followed Snickers' though increasingly mundane passages. They'd left the more open spaces some time ago and were now navigating through the maze of corridors deep within the ship. She wasn't worried about being double-crossed. The lunatics would have to do some truly monstrous things for her to start worrying about them. She was, on the other hand, worried about being refused. It wasn't something that happened often. But this was one of those rare moments where it was entirely possible. "It's here," Snickers said as she grabbed onto a padded handlebar on a corner and used it to flip around the intersection. Ivil walked after her, the squad the brass had sent floating a few paces behind. As she turned the corner, she took in what was very clearly some sort of defensive station. Two arc clowns stood on either side of a heavily armored bulkhead door. C-classers, both. Snickers talked to them with great big gestures, then pointed towards Ivil who was coming up behind her. "Yes, and she's literally right there. Have you been huffing pigment?" The captain said she didn't want to be bothered, one of them said. "The captain can lick my ass for all I care," Snickers snapped. She blew off Lovecraft's head. "I think she could take the two of you without blinking, and I won't stand in her way when that happens." "Is there a problem?" Ivil asked. The bulkhead door behind the guard slammed open and both war clowns jumped. A woman stood in the entranceway, looking entirely unamused. Her eyes locked onto Ivil's. "So, you're the reason I had to call General Quarters. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused for me?" "I could imagine," Ivil said. "Are you the captain?" "I am." "Come in. Leave your dogs behind." Ivil half turned towards Sonic Spectre and the other Imperial Valkyries. "Stay," she ordered simply before following the captain into what was clearly some sort of stateroom. There was a table up on the ceiling with chairs all around, but the lower part of the room was more of an office and bar. The captain walked up to her desk and pressed a button. The door shut. She turned, arms crossing as she floated slightly above the ground, anchored by something invisible. Another C-classer, Ivil sensed. Probably one of the last on board the ship, actually. She couldn't feel any B-classers nearby. It made some sense. The lunatics were insistent on sharing the cores they had, rather than concentrating them into a few powerful people. "So, you're here to see our oracle," the captain said. "I am," Ivil replied. She walked over to the bar, then started looking through the bottles. She picked one off of a rack. Titanian bourbon, aged in imported French oak. She glanced over the cups and tumblers available. They were all soft plastic, designed to be squeezed and with tight openings. The sorts meant to be pressed against the neck of a bottle, filled with a lurch, then squeezed out into the drinker's mouth. Ivil pushed them aside, then smiled as she found an old crystal tumbler in the back. She popped the top off the bottle, then tipped it over the tumbler. The bourbon started to float away before she gave it a look, and the alcohol experienced gravity for the first time as it splashed into her cup. "Want a cup?" she asked. "I'm good," the captain said. That bottle is worth more than what I make in a year. You're paid? Ivil asked. Not nearly enough. Why do you want to see the Oracle? That's between me and the Oracle, Ivil said. She's a gossip. Ivil considered it. She won't be. Not about this. The captain hummed. Are you going to kill her? She asked. If that's what I wanted to do, there would be easier ways to go about it, Ivil said. She swirled her cup around, then took a sip. It was decent. All right. I'll have Claire come here. She's probably on her way already. Or hiding in an escape pod. Or she managed to sneak away a week ago, and no one found out about it until now. Ivil shrugged. That would tell her a lot, if it was the case. And it was just one of the risks when dealing with people able to see into the future. That's fine, she said. There was a knock at the door. The captain sighed. Of course, she said before she reached back and pressed on the same button to open the door. A woman floated into the room, flipped around on herself, then crashed into the drinks cabinet with a rattle of glass on glass. She reached out and grabbed onto something to steady herself, but that something was the bottle Ivil had put down. The bottle, unable to stop her from flying away, was instead flung against the far wall where it shattered explosively, creating a cloud of bourbon and glass. Claire. I swear on all that honks, I will tan your ass, the captain snapped. I'm sorry. Claire said. She managed to flip herself around enough so that one booted foot was able to touch the deck. Something clunked, and the young woman found herself rooted on the spot enough that she was able to right herself. Claire the clairvoyant was younger than Ivil had expected. She had a mess of brown hair, far longer than was fashionable, and her full face mask was a transparent oval, with only a few tabs on the side. It was Martian tech, Ivil recognized. I've been waiting for you to show up forever, Claire said as she pointed straight at Ivil. And now you're here. Did you bring it? Bring what? The captain asked. I did, Ivil said. She reached up and undid the front of her uniform, then fished out something small from an inner pocket. A core. It was no bigger than a marble, and yet in Ivil's vision it practically thrummed with power. Gimme. Claire demanded. Her hands made grabbing gestures, though she didn't actually come closer. You know what I want already, Ivil said. The clairvoyant sighed, then looked to the captain. You should give us a minute, she said. Or 5, actually. And turn off the cameras and mics. Yes, even the ones no one knows about. Ivil will find them otherwise and then you'll need to replace them in a wall. The captain crossed her arms. I'm not sure I want to just leave, she said. Claire rolled her eyes. Come on. Trust me. This'll be great. I promise. Chapter 5, Clairvoyant. The human mind was not suited to precognition. Joy, more often than not, comes from the anticipation of a good thing happening. No one is happy because they are eating a real meat burger. They are happy before they eat it, they are happy that they'd be well fed later, they are happy that they'd be able to brag about it. Human brains feed happiness to anticipation. Anticipation doesn't work out so well when you know exactly what will happen from the moment you get a precognition core until the moment you die. More often than not, a precog will end it on their own terms, usually soon after getting their precognitive abilities. Some are smart enough to just get rid of the core outright. Some gain very weak precognition, more of a sense of the near future, or very keen reflexes. Ivil had some of these, and she had very meticulously avoided upgrading those powers. Those who weren't smart about precognition tended to die by their own hand. Or they avoided it by simply going absolutely insane. Claire was a fantastic example of the latter. Oh, Claire said as she spun herself around. Her hair flew out into a tangled mess in her dress, another oddity on board a ship, spun out with the centrifugal force of her spin. I've been looking forward to this since forever. I'm glad to see that you're excited, Ivil said. She tossed the little core she held up and caught it when it came back down. Do you know what I'm here to ask about already? Claire reached out and caught one of the chairs mounted to the ceiling, bringing her spin to an abrupt halt. She panted, then locked eye attention onto the little core Ivil was holding. I need to hear you say it, she said. You do? Yup. As a function of your power? Ivil asked. Claire grinned. No. I just want to hear you say it. Maybe with a please slipped in there somewhere. Please don't make me paint the walls with your innards. I'll have to give your cores to someone else to get what I want then, Ivil said. Claire laughed, clearly unbothered by the threat. That was another problem with precogs that were strong enough. They sapped the fun out of life. She pushed herself down until her boots clunked onto the floor and locked in place. All right, Claire said. I do need to hear you ask though, threats and pleases aside. And the usual warnings come into play. The usual warnings? Ivil asked. Claire nodded. Right, you might not know. Everyone that works with me has heard the spiel before. It's been a while. Okay. She cleared her throat. I, clairvoyant, seer and seer of the future, do warn thee who wishes to know what has not passed. The future is ever-changing and in flux, but in the passing of souls and the threat of mankind is a pattern unseen by most. The weave is known to me, and by following the path of your future's thread, I can discern your place within its pattern. Claire's voice had deepened, and Ivil felt a power's touch skimming past and around her. To most it would be little more than a shiver down their spine. To her, it was a siren going off in the night. Interesting, Ivil said. So, this warning. Claire sighed. Look, the long and short of it is that my predictions are the best, but they are not infallible. Also, I might not tell you what you want to hear. I've had some people get really pissed off with me when reality doesn't line up with their expectations. I imagine there's a story there. Ivil asked. Oh, you wouldn't believe it. Claire said. She swung her arms wide, then had to spin them around to return to standing straight. I had one mom blow up on me because she wanted to know when she'd reunite with her lost kid, and the answer was never. Which, yeah, that sucked. I also avoid doing predictions for religious people. They want to know when they'll meet God, or when the end will come, or whatever, and they're never happy with what I have to say. You could lie. PFFT, no, Claire said. I know what'll happen to me if I get a reputation for lying, and it ain't pretty. Ivil nodded along. Very well. I imagine you know what the deal between us is already? You gimme the tasty ultra-rare core right there, and I don't whisper a word of what you asked me to anyone. And you know what will happen if you do tell people? Claire snorted. One of the 24 or so spies in the lunatics will report it up the chain, word will get out, you'll find out, then the next thing I know I'm waking up on the void of space, choking on nothing while my eyes pop out of my skull from the pressure change. The last thing I'll see is this ship floating in 2 big parts. Yeah, I know. I don't play with my victims, Ivil said. That's the only comfort you'd get. Uh-huh, Claire agreed. She leaned forwards, feet still planted on the ground and hands grasping for Ivil. She grabbed onto one of Ivil's hands. Now. Shall we do this? Her hands were cold. Yes, Ivil said. Claire grinned wide, and any vestige of sanity slipped out of her gaze. Now, ask. Ivil didn't clear her throat. She didn't allow herself the luxury of being nervous. Instead, she asked. I want to find true love. Claire snorted. There's a couple on deck 7. Older people, like 60s or so, been married for 40 years and still adore the sight of each other. It's almost sickeningly sweet. Ivil glared. That's not what I meant, she said. Then be specific, Claire said. Fine then. I want to find someone who will love me, and who deserves my loyalty. Someone that I can live a happy life with. I've been at the top for too long. I need someone to kill my loneliness. Claire blinked. Well, that's something. But okay, I think I can manage. There was a wash of unfelt warmth through the room. Ivil fixed herself against it, resisting. She noticed the sweat pooling on Claire's forehead. You're not making this easy, you know, Claire muttered. Ivil let go, and the warmth washed through and past her, then back. It stopped as easily as it came, and Claire let go of Ivil's hand and fell back. So? Ivil asked. Gimme a minute, Claire said. She brushed a hand through her hair, which had started to mat against her scalp. Oh, this headache had better be worth it. Any results? Ivil asked. Yup, Claire said. Yes? Ivil asked. Claire brushed the sweat off of her hands along the front of her dress. Go to Ceres. You'll find what you're looking for on this piece of junk ship called the... held together. You're going to need to take that ship to wherever it's going next. That's it? Ivil asked. That's hardly precise. Hey, you're getting good service here, woman, Claire protested. I'm leading the horse to water. Am I the horse? Ivil asked. Because I might find it insulting, and your usefulness to me is certainly coming to a middle. Chill, Claire said. If I tell you everything, it doesn't work out the way you want it to. This way it does. Figure the rest out yourself, I've already pointed you in the right direction. Clairvoyance work here is done. Now gimme the core. Ivil sighed and tossed the core over. Claire fumbled it out of the air, then grinned at the little marble-sized item. Is your name really Clairvoyant? Ivil asked. Is yours really Ivil Antagonist? Fair enough. Right, you'd best get going, you have like 6 days to make it to Ceres or you'll miss your chance and never find love. Then you'll die old and bitter and angry and lonely. Ivil quirked an eyebrow at that pronouncement. I see. I won't linger then. Thank you for your service, Claire. And to recall what'll happen if you speak of this. Oh, piffle, you think you're the only person that asks me about love. You wouldn't believe how many divorces and marriages I've caused. There's 7 little baby Claires on Hamia and it's all my fault. I see. Well, try to keep your mouth shut and your head on your shoulders. Ivil nodded to the seer, then walked to the door. It opened on her approach and she slipped out into the corridor where Captain Circus was in the middle of a stare down with Sonic Spectre. There were several more war clowns out now. We're going, Ivil said as she moved past it all. Come on, I don't have time to waste on inconsequential things. Good day, Captain. If time was pressing, then she'd do what she could to slip across the system. Ceres wasn't close, but she'd make it. Chapter 6, Non-Way Communication. Nothing was faster than light. Nothing ordinary, in any case. The exception, therefore, was the unordinary, and that was something that Core users had a monopoly on. Therefore, when Martian Naval Command wanted to know what was going on with the fleet they'd let out to Ivil Antagonist, they relied upon unordinary communication methods. They were called the Partridge Brothers. Both of them had gained copies of similar cores, and while neither of them were anything more than D-classers, their worth to the nation of Mars ensured that they wouldn't ever lack for anything, unless that thing was free time. One of the Partridge brothers was laying within a vat filled with a non-Newtonian fluid. A breathing apparatus was fixed to his face. His eyes were closed. Wires ran from his neck into a large server bank whose flickering lights were the only source of illumination in the room. This room was deep within the Star Dreadnought. There were guards by the door. Automated defenses tucked away and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. The space wasn't on any of the ship's official blueprints. It was almost as safe as could be. The only way it could be safer was if its position could be hidden by obscurity, but there was only so much they could do to hide a ship of this size. Across from him, Ivil stood with her hands casually folded at the small of her back. A semicircle of plate-sized holographic displays hovered before her. They flickered, and soon the room was lit by a soft blue glow as 7 figures appeared in miniature before her. She recognized 3. The others didn't matter. Admiral, Chancellor, she greeted. The 2 admirals, the Admiral of the Martian Defense Fleet and the Grand Admiral of the Navy, both nodded in greetings, but it was the Chancellor that spoke first. Hello, Ivil, he said. The man had a smooth baritone voice that carried well, and he stood tall and proud, seeming rather regal despite the small stature of his hologram. Hello, Ivil replied. I imagine that you wanted to talk to me for a reason? The Grand Admiral of the Navy scoffed. I'd like to know what's going on with one of my best fleets, he said. Our mission on Hamia was accomplished, Ivil said simply. We will be heading inwards next. Back to Mars? The Chancellor asked. No. Ceres first. You can have your fleet once I'm there. Admiral Vestry will likely be pleased to be back home, Ivil said. I could imagine, the Admiral of the Defense said. Though that begs the question, where will you be in that time? Are you going to be staying on Ceres? Ivil hesitated for a moment, then gestured to the screens. Can't we have some level of privacy? She asked. 4 of the 7 holograms winked out. The Partridge brothers would still hear, of course, but they had heard plenty of classified things already. All that remained were the admirals and the Chancellor who walked within the hologram, likely to a more private location. Go ahead, he said. Once on Ceres I'll be departing for an unknown amount of time aboard a ship called the Hell Together, Ivil said. I don't know for how long, and I'm uncertain of my destination. The Grand Admiral leaned to the side, inputting some information into a tablet. The Hell Together. A small cargo ship currently en route to Ceres. Due to arrive today, in fact. Overdue payments all over. It's practically a relic. What is its next destination? The Chancellor asked. Jupiter, the Admiral said. According to its flight plans. Though with Ceres, you never know. Then I suppose I'll be heading to Jupiter, Ivil said with a shrug. Is that an issue? I won't require any escorts, nor will I suffer any impediments. You seem quite serious about this, the Chancellor said. You met with the Oracle on Haumea, correct? Is this because of her prompting? Obviously, she replied. He nodded. I always trusted that you have Mars' best interest at heart, Ivil. Whatever this mission of yours is, rest assured that Mars is ready to support you. Ivil didn't fail to notice the 2 admirals holding back some less than flattering expressions at that. The Chancellor's role was important, certainly, and he was, nominally, the leader of Mars, at least on paper. In reality, the real power of Mars was in its military. They, of course, paid lip service to the Chancellor, and there were several political realities in play that would require either a lifetime on Mars to understand, or some deep study to uncover. I appreciate it, Ivil said. I might require some assistance, as it happens. I need to cover identity. I've prepared a small brief for Mint with some suggestions for what I need. I'll leave the details to the professionals. The Admiral of Defense nodded. That would, technically, fall under his purview. I'll have the boys in black do what they do best, he said. Thank you, Ivil said. These kinds of meetings were always so very tense. The levers of power on and around Mars were a Rube Goldberg machine that built itself as it went. They shifted constantly, grew and expanded and changed. Ivil was a wrecking ball poised over the machine. Able to destroy it, but nonetheless supported by it all the same. You asked for privacy, the Grand Admiral said. It wasn't a question, because his position didn't allow him to bow to Ivil. Instead, he brought it up and let her fill in the rest. I don't know how Mars will react to my temporary vacation, Ivil said. I think I'm more than due some time off, and I don't plan on making much of a fuss. Nonetheless, I'd be remiss if I didn't ensure that the timing wasn't critical, in some way. There's always something, the Chancellor said with a sad smile. Let's see. There's a refugee crisis around the Mercury-Venus circle. I don't think that'll impact us, but it might draw some attention from the Earth Alliance. The Alliance of Moons is acting strangely. I think there might be something new going on with them, though they're keeping mum about it. Deimos is trying to get feelers out, and Phobos is doing its own thing. I don't think either situation calls for your brand of attention. No noteworthy military maneuvers, the Grand Admiral said. One of his eyes, a mechanical implant, was glowing as he reviewed something. Some training exercises around Jupiter from the Earth Alliance. Some movement from Saturn to Jupiter as well from Titan and the others, but that's likely a show of force since Jupiter isn't keen on being bullied. Ceres is a mess, as usual. We ought to do something about Ceres, the Defense Admiral said. Especially if we are going to park the Star Dreadnought on their front step. There are some pirates that we could wipe out. They've been a thorn, the other admiral agreed. Ivil shook her head. Do as you will. I don't see any of that concerning me. If the system is at peace, then I'll be able to act as I please without any concerns of some cataclysm pulling me back." The Chancellor and the Admirals exchanged a glance, then the Chancellor shrugged. "I suppose we can live without your direct assistance for some time. What's that old expression, about having a hammer and seeing nails all over?" Ivil didn't quite laugh, but she did breath out from her nose. "I have a rough idea of what you mean, yes," she said. "I won't be entirely outside of anyone's ability to communicate. If you're so worried about me, then keep a ship or two on standby." "We'll do just that," the Grand Admiral said. "Be careful around Ceres, Ivil. That place is a hive of scum and villainy." "I don't intend to stay there long," she replied. Ivil said her farewells and ended the communication. When all the holograms finally dimmed, she found herself in the same poorly lit room, eyeing the Partridge brother still laying within his vat. She wondered what life was like for him and his brother. Eternal subservience to the nation of Mars. Power, but power chained. Something that might have been her lot in life had she not gained power fast and hard enough. Ivil sighed, noted the time, then rubbed at the back of her neck. If she was going to be away from the Martian fleet for any amount of time, then this might be one of her last opportunities to attend to one of the few things that kept her solidly grounded. It was about time for her to visit her therapist. She wondered what he would have to say about her current progress. Chapter 7, Ceres. There were 27 pillars keeping the two halves of the Ceres apart, and all 27 of them were rigged to blow. At the moment, there were 19 pirate crews, gangs, syndicates, and corporations that owned those 27 pillars between them. At any moment, when hostilities got too warm, they could threaten to literally press the big red button and doom them all to be crushed. The space between the two chunks of Ceres was called the crevice, and it was the asshole of the solar system. The crevice, when classified, falls into a neat little space usually reserved for slums, favelas, and shanty towns. This subcategory exists for places where the rule of law is weakest, where poverty and violence is the norm, and where someone with muscles and guns can become a king, at least until someone with more of either sweeps through. No one wanted to live in the crevice. 20 million did anyway. The dwarf planet had been cracked in two during the opening months of the Second Intra-System War, but due to the size of the two halves, they had eventually gravitated back towards each other. That was when the inhabitants of Ceres had decided to create a better, more secure home for themselves. The planetoid wasn't sheared through at the middle, it was more of a two-thirds split. That split remained open to this day, held in place by massive pillars created from derelict warships. The crevice was one of the biggest cities in the solar system. It encompassed the entire space between the two parts of Ceres, a space entirely walled off from the outside. On approaching Ceres, a keen night traveler would be able to make out a ring of light banded around the dwarf planet, where the city pushed out of its rocky confines. The crevice, the shining jewel of free Ceres, was a city held hostage by its own inhabitants. Right now, Ivil was staring at Ceres from one of the forward 6 of the Purgatorial Oblivion. There was no question, when she said that she needed to be on Ceres within 6 days, as to which ship she would be riding to the smuggler's moon. There were consequences to the choice, of course. Ceres was run by pirates and killers and worse. Those sorts of people tended to have a powerful dislike of the rigid way that the Empire of Mars, or even the Earth Alliance, did things. Laws didn't agree with them. When they ran into patrols, they were as likely to open fire as they were to burn hard and run. It made the entire space around Ceres a deeply uncomfortable place to police and patrol, and one which was simply not economically viable to control. It didn't help that Mars hired pirates to attack Earth Alliance stations and ships, and the Earth Alliance returned the favor. The best way to avoid problems when flying past Ceres was to be too big of a threat for the pirates to bother. The Imperial Star Dreadnought Purgatorial Oblivion, currently flying with a small escort fleet of several cruisers, destroyers, and frigates, was too big of a threat for anything on Ceres to try anything. At the moment, there was something of an exodus going on. Ivil's attention wandered from one ship to another, noting how quick they were to run. There had been several hundred rapid evacuations around Ceres as pirates and smugglers burned hard to get away from their safe haven. The Empire had just done the equivalent of setting a rabid grizzly loose in the middle of a busy daycare, and the children were running for their lives. "We'll be arriving in 3 hours, ma'am," a voice said from over Ivil's shoulder. She glanced back at Sonic Spectre. The B-classer was hovering in the air, still occasionally winking out of existence for a brief second. "Good," Ivil said simply. "I can't imagine that the Purgatorial will fit in the crevice." "Permission to be blunt, ma'am." "Go ahead," Ivil replied. "I don't think the Admiral would want to risk it," Sonic Spectre said. Ivil nodded. That was fair. The ship was large, and the maneuvers to squeeze it into the crevice would be exceptionally complex. It was possible, she was certain, but then all it would take were a few suicidal fools to cause immense damage. "We'll take the Lucky Despot down," Ivil decided. "Do you think the Lucky's captain would appreciate the attention?" "I think they would be rather honored," Sonic said. "Ma'am, if I may, what are we going to do on Ceres?" "I will be going on a mission there," Ivil said. "It's somewhat self-serving, but I suspect it will be quite good for the Empire overall." "I see," Sonic replied. "May I know what kind of mission?" "To better prepare my squad." "I'll be going solo," Ivil said. She felt Sonic's surprise. It was hard to read expressions on Sonic's doll face. "Is the threat so great?" "No. Rather, I'll be going undercover." "You will be going undercover?" Sonic asked. "Yes." "Is that so surprising?" Sonic shook her head, then paused. "Permission to be honest?" "Denied." "You'll do fine, ma'am." Ivil made her way to the Lucky Despot, boarded the ship, then waited within the frigate's bridge for the warship to be undocked. It was another couple of hours before they were let loose. The captain, at least, seemed far less nervous now than she had been on their first trip out. Instead of the captain being nervous, it was Ceres as a whole that was currently stressed. The traffic control agent, Ivil refused to call them crevice control, they connected to was a stuttering mess, though he did properly direct the Lucky Despot towards an open section of the crevice. Ivil installed herself behind the ship's navigator and watched through the screens as they approached the crevice. The inside of the slice cut off from the side of the planet was unsurprisingly dark. Sunlight only streamed in when the planet was aligned just right, and this wasn't one of those moments. Instead, the interior was illuminated by several thousand strong lights pointing every which way. More light came from huge banner ads, some of which streamed off the side of the pillars holding up the topmost half of the slice. Smaller ships, tugs and personal craft, flew across the cityscape, avoiding the taller buildings and the glowing tram lines that zigzagged through the space. The center of the crevice was the residential area. There was less light there, only distant shadows hinting at massive residential blocks. The outer sections of the crevice were one massive shipyard and dock. Room enough for entire fleets to park themselves above and below. The Lucky Despot was guided into a free berth, and the captain and navigator glided the ship into place with all of the gentleness of a feather in low gravity. "We're here, ma'am," the captain said. "It may take a while for us to be connected to Chura's airlock system. They are notoriously unreliable." "I'll take that under advisement, Captain." "Thank you," Ivil said. "Shall we wait here for your return?" the captain asked. Ivil considered it. "If I'm not back within 2 days, then you should consider leaving," she said. "Also, as you may know better than I do, where might I find a registry of ships currently on Ceres?" The captain frowned. "Imperial Intelligence probably has something like that, ma'am. But if you want the official listing, then Crevice Control, the local traffic control group, probably has an up-to-date listing available. I wouldn't trust it, but it definitely exists." "I see, thank you, Captain. You've done a great job so far." Ivil nodded to the captain, then casually walked off the bridge. Ceres had some amount of gravity to it. A minuscule amount, but enough to pull dust and people down. Ivil enjoyed it. There was something comforting about the pull of a planetary body, the feeling of her own mass mattering. She made her way over to the ship's airlocks, stepped into it, then waited for the airlock to cycle. It did, eventually, and she walked into the far crustier, rust and graffiti-covered airlock on the other side. It was leaking. Ivil crossed her arms, then realized after a minute long wait that the airlock wasn't going to finish cycling at all, not while it was pissing air out so quickly. With a sigh, Ivil made the door into the station disappear, then she stepped through to the other side. Now it was someone else's problem. She had her own problems to look forward to, like discovering where the hell Together was birthed, and exactly what kind of ship it was to begin with. Fortunately, it didn't take more than a dozen steps through the dingy, poorly lit corridors of the crevice that someone approached her, a small vibrating knife held casually in one hand. She blinked. Was this a mugging? Already? Ah yes, a hive of scum and villainy. I'd almost forgotten. Chapter 8, Perfect Disguise. Ivil Antagonist was hardly a fool. She knew this about herself, and she knew that she wasn't all-knowing. The combination of not being moronic and also being aware of her own deficiencies was actually quite potent. There had been others, leaders, people who thought that they'd gained enough course to make it past the lower barriers of humanity, people who thought they knew better. Ivil had seen plenty of that sort think that power translated to capability. Instead of making a fool of herself, Ivil stayed in her lane. She was the all-powerful hammer of Mars. Fleets would fly out to challenge her and be rent into so much scrap. Flights of enemy Valkyries would donate their cores to her through no choice of their own. She was good at murder and death. She left the bureaucratic matters of running Mars in the hands of the bureaucrats. The medical matters were in the hands of doctors, and matters of war pertained to the Admiralty. When someone stepped out of line, Ivil would put them, or their remains, back in place. It was a simple way to run things, and it worked for Mars. Right now, Ivil was going to infiltrate a ship she knew nothing about, with a crew of unknown origins. The issue was that Ivil had passing knowledge of how romance worked. Mostly from rom-coms and soap operas. A romance begun on the foundation of lies would, inevitably, lead to drama. She didn't want to find her lover dropped into a multi-year coma only for her identical twin to show up out of the blue. Such things were beneath her. So, in essence, she needed a disguise. Ivil Antagonist had been agonizing about this for some time. She had met with some of Mars' best spy masters, but their ideas had been profoundly unhelpful. She was not going to walk around trying to look like some unassuming, lost paper pusher that needed transit to some backwater. She needed a disguise, yes, but she needed it to at least try to capture the magnitude of power that Ivil held. At the same time, she needed that disguise to make sense. Moving about as a powerful businesswoman, for example, didn't make sense when such a person would likely have a ship of their own. It had taken some time for her to pick out a suitable disguise, one that would be common enough, without being so lowly that she would have to debase herself. Ivil walked through the many corridors of the crevice. This first leg of her trip was arranged already. She went down 4 levels from the area where the Lucky Despot had connected and to a section of the port facility that had several restaurants. Most of these were unmanned stations, though not all of them. She was actually surprised to notice a few food places from Mars. The Red Rock Cafe she passed could have been on one of the stations in Mars orbit. Past all of these was an unassuming, family-owned prepackaged food place. The sort of business lined with freezers of quick heat packs that were all uniformly shaped and easy to slurp a warm meal from. These were the kinds of meals a cheap crew would eat on a long voyage. They required no kitchens, cost little per meal, and could be comfortably eaten in a multi-G or zero-G environment. Ivil slipped into the shop and went to the counter where an older woman was standing. "I'm here for the..." Ivil sighed. "Lost Star Special." "Of course, ma'am, follow me," the old woman replied. This level of subterfuge was beneath her. Ivil followed the woman anyway into a surprisingly spacious backstore. There were more freezers here, a small office space, and an entire rack of clothing. "Thank you," Ivil said, dismissing the woman. The woman bowed, then picked up a small briefcase and placed it closer so that Ivil wouldn't miss it. She darted out of the room. Ivil turned to the racks of clothing, then sighed. She swept the room, searching for any cameras or anything intrusive, but predictably found nothing. This entire deception had been arranged by MINT, the Martian Intelligence and Naval Tactics Division. They didn't mess around when it came to spycraft. Ivil squeezed out of her uniform, then into one of the outfits MINT had bought for her. It was a nice enough outfit, if rather utilitarian. A custom-fit brown jumpsuit of the airtight variety. Not pretty, exactly, but still well-fitted, and it cooperated with Martian boots. The upper half of the outfit was a white synthweave coat, the same rather expensive material used by naval officers, with a high collar and some additional pockets and pouches. Atop that, a breastplate with a few dings and scratches in its white paint. It had a breather module, and a forward and rear-mounted 6-direction compressed air jet system, for movement in 0GS. All in all, it was a functional outfit that would give her the appearance of someone well used to work in the field, without seeming as though she were impoverished. The little logo for the University of Hellas on the breastplate brought it together. She folded her pitch-black uniform and placed it carefully within an available suitcase already filled with a few changes of clothes and some necessities. The last item she placed within was her Valkyrie pin. Then, with a twist, Ivil vanished the suitcase and its contents. Ivil decided that she liked her new outfit, and she liked the look of herself wearing it. It had been a very long time since she had worn anything but her uniform. This made her look less like a warlord and more like an adventuring scholar. She picked up the briefcase and opened it. There were several tablets within, all with the University of Hellas logo, and a small wallet that she flicked open. The papers within painted her as Ivil, tenured professor of astroarchaeology. She packed her things up, then slipped out of the room. The lady by the counter didn't even acknowledge her. Now, onto the hell together. One of the tablets in her briefcase had an up-to-date map of the crevice and every ship docked on Ceres. It was everything that MINT could get and hand over to her, probably enough classified information to start a small-scale war. She navigated through the map until she discovered the hell together. It was a quarter way around the ring of the crevice, but, fortunately, the city had public transportation in the form of high-speed rail. Ivil didn't want to board the cramped, odorous train car, but she made her way into it anyway. A small use of power pushed the plebs away from her and her suitcase so that none of their germs would get onto her. When one of them tried to reach towards her ear either for a pinch or for her wallet, Ivil broke every bone in his hand. They were clean breaks. They'd heal eventually. His screams did wonders to earn her a little more space. It took 20 minutes to reach the right exit, then she walked out of the car and onto a grungy, poorly lit street in one of the poorer docks. Fortunately, Ivil wouldn't be spending enough time in the crevice to really scope out how its society worked, but there was clearly some form of stratification between the poor and the destitute and the few who had fought enough to earn a little something. The hell together was docked in one of the worst of these sections. That didn't bode well. Ivil kept moving anyway. Soon, after a ride up a rickety elevator and through a station airlock, she arrived in the docks proper. One wall was made of foot-thick glass, giving anyone walking by a fantastic view of the ship's part above. There was an ancient Earth Systems Apoca-class cargo hull part above, next to a still shiny Thanthella Europa and Star Runner. They were beautiful ships. A little worse for wear, and aged, but Ivil could appreciate them all the same. It wasn't something she made a big fuss over, but she did enjoy spacecraft with all of the enthusiasm of a middle-aged car geek. There was a reason so many Martian warships had sweeping lines and aggressive forms, even if these weren't necessary for their function. She continued to walk, eyes constantly flicking back out of the windows to take in the ships above. There was an Ur-class tug, a centuries-old Duskland-class Martian warship called the Emergency Complaints, docked next to a Moment-class ship, the Hawk, from Io. It took her some time before she reached the end of the docks, and as she went, she discovered that the quality of ships docked further out seemed to degrade the more she went. Ivil was feeling something like nerves building within her. She quenched these. The mission would carry on. Then she laid eyes upon her destination, the hell together. That clairvoyant had better be right, she decided. Because otherwise, She would be having words with her. Chapter 9, The Held Together. The Held Together was a relic. It belonged in a museum. The average grandpa would look at it and think, damn, that's one old ship. In essence, it wasn't a plucky new thing, and every sign suggested that it moved with all of the grace of a one-legged geriatric. The ship had 6 cargo containers to a side. Nice and simple. 12 standard containers was a good load. Someone could make a living hauling knickknacks from Luna to Mars with that kind of space. 2 of the pods had clearly been modified, however, and Ivil wasn't sure if the rest were even functional. The Held Together's cockpit was a wide, flat thing at the front. Real windows. Space for 3. Below that, a bristle of maneuvering thrusters and the ship's reverse thruster, jutting out of the bottom like a cleft chin. The ship's spine was a thin, narrow space that ran all the way down to its fat ass. Back in the day, engines weren't so good. At some point, someone had sold off the Held Together's massive set of original thrusters. They were replaced by something newer. Newer being relative. Ivil would bet on the current set being pre-Third Intrasystem War. Still, newer meant smaller, and now the Held Together had 3 engines sitting inside cowling meant for much larger thrusters. It didn't give her the impression that the Held Together could move any faster than the average tug. The ship was covered in a slathering of yellow paint. Ivil recognized it. It was the cheapest paint available in Earth orbit. The kind of almost fluorescent stuff they sprayed onto tugs and barges and deep space mining rigs. It caught the eye. In a bad way. A few panels along the ship's side weren't the same color, others had had their paint scoured off by thruster burns or micrometeorite impacts. Ivil could survive in empty space without a ship. She could probably swim her way back to the nearest outpost or planet, if need be. It was the only thing that kept her walking towards the Held Together, the reassurance that even when the rusty old thing failed, she at least wouldn't die. The Held Together was docked from the rear by a large cargo airlock, the sort big enough for someone to drive a forklift right through it. That meant that the hold was open to anyone. Ivil paused not too far from it and scooped out one of the tablets from her bags. She scanned through it. There was enough information there, at a glance, for her to build a convincing cover story. She memorized it with a sweep, then nodded to herself before walking around the final corner and towards the ship. Surprisingly, the crew hadn't abandoned the ship while they could. Or at least, one of them didn't. There was a young woman sitting on a high stool next to a workbench. A small device was taken apart in front of her. She had tools, all connected by small wires to the workbench, splayed out around her. She jumped when Ivil took a step onto the airlock between the ship and hold. Turning, the girl blinked at Ivil, then looked past her then back. She raised a grease-covered hand. "Hi." "Hello," Ivil said. "Is this a Held Together?" A small part of her wished that it wasn't. The girl smiled. No, not a girl. She was maybe 10 years Ivil's junior. Her dimpled cheeks and tiny stature made her seem younger, but she was an adult by anyone's standards. This is, and she is. Pardon. I mean, this is the Held Together. And she is. As in she's held together, you know? Because she is not. Broken? Mostly. Ivil nodded slowly. I heard you were going to Callisto. That's what their flight plane said, in any case. Are you taking on passengers? Oh. The girl jumped off her seat, almost bouncing too high so that her head was nearly bashed against some loose cargo held by a net in the ceiling. We love passengers. I mean, I love passengers. Did you arrange things with the captain yet? I haven't, Ivil said. I just need passage to Callisto, for cheap. That would have to do for a cover story. Someone traveling cheaply. Anyone with any amount of money and a lick of sense would take any other ship to get to Jupiter. Cheap we can do, the girl said. Is that all of your stuff? I packed light, Ivil said. Nice. All right. Come with me. I can give you a bit of a tour while we're at it. Oh, wait, no, I can't. The girl froze up as realization dawned. You can't? Ivil asked. We have another passenger coming. I'm supposed to help her. The girl shook her head. The captain will be real cross with me if I don't stay here. Wait, I'll call Missy over. She can give you the big tour. But you'll have to ask me to give you one too. She doesn't appreciate this old gal the way I do. That seems fine, Ivil said. By the way, what's your name? Oh, I'm 26. I was asking for your name, not your age. The girl blinked, then laughed with a snort. No, my name's 26. I'm a ringer. That's not my age. Well, not yet. Gimme a year. Oh, I see, Ivil said. What's your name, miss? 26 asked as she bounced her way to the back of the hall towards an intercom mounted to the wall. I forgot to ask, sorry. Are you from Hellas? I'm a professor from there, yes, Ivil said. My name is Ivil. Cool. I'll go and get Missy, she'll help. Missy? The first mate, 26 explained. She thumped the intercom and there was a crackle as it came on. Missy, can you come to the hangar please? We have a new passenger. Thank you. The intercom squealed a moment later, and someone spoke through it with a complete lack of passion. On my way. Thank you, Ivil said to 26. The young woman gave Ivil a thumbs up. No problem. It'll be nice having more people on board. The hell together can be a little quiet sometimes. Just, the captain means well. Set boundaries and she'll be fine. Oh, and? If there's a problem with your room, let me know. I'm the ship's mechanic. It's a full-time job, but I try to do what I can to help. That's kind of you, Ivil said. 26 nodded along. Sure thing. So, Hellas University? That's so cool. I wish I went to a school like that. Where do you go to school for your education as a mechanic? Ivil asked. Huh? I just picked things up here and there, 26 said. Are you certified? The girl froze up, eyes going wide for a moment and her smile turning plastic. What? Yeah, of course I am. Ha! She was not. Of course, Ivil agreed. She wondered if it would be possible to have a team of Martian mechanics sneakily look over the ship before they left the dock. Just in case. She'd take a look at things herself. She wasn't a mechanic, but she could tell when something was on its last legs. The door at the back of the hangar groaned open and a woman walked into the room. She was of a height with Ivil herself, dark hair and an all-black spacesuit. Ivil stood a little taller as she took the woman in. This was a core holder. No more than a D-classer, but her cores felt well and properly integrated. More interesting still, the woman immediately reminded Ivil of a lunatic war clown. She didn't have the faceless mask, or the red nose. In fact, she lacked any color. Her skin was an almost sickly pale only accentuated by dark eyeliner and lipstick. Not a clown, then. A war mem? That was an uncommon sight. The woman locked eyes with Ivil, then sighed. You're the passenger? She asked. Missy. Be nice, 26 said. Miss, Vil, this is Missy, the first mate. Hello, Ivil said. A pleasure. Missy said. You got cash? Ivil chuckled. I have enough, she said. Assuming you accept transfers from the First Bank of Mars. Missy seemed to consider that for a moment before she nodded. Yeah. We can do that. They charge fees out the ass. Missy, 26 hissed. It's fine 26, Missy said. So, you need a ride to Jupiter? Callisto, Ivil said. I think you're headed that way? That's where we're chartered to go, Missy said. But there ain't much that way. What's the fancy sort like you want with Callisto? I'm an astroarchaeologist, Ivil said. I'm going there for some scholarly pursuits. Huh? Missy said. She didn't seem to trust that entirely, but she shrugged a shoulder languidly and turned back into the ship. Follow me, fancy, let me show you to your bunk. Don't give her one of the leaky rooms. 26 called back as Ivil followed Missy. This was an auspicious start, Ivil thought. Chapter 10, War Mem. If the average lunatic warrior was the war clown, someone on the edge of sanity, equipped with one or more cores and enough training to keep themselves alive in a hairy situation. Then the War Mim was the equivalent of the Lunatics Special Ops. Where a war clown had esprit and reveled in chaos, the War Mim danced a different tune. Their flavor of chaos was less about reveling in big, bombastic actions, and more subtle. It was the faint stink that came with a ship's life support failing at a critical moment, the strange rattle an engine made before it failed catastrophically. Stealth, deception, lies and misinformation. Nothing that anyone would associate with the Lunatics, which is what made them almost perfect for the job. Almost. As subtle and silent as a War Mim might be, they were still lunatics at their core. It was easy to pick them out of the crowd. It was only obscurity that kept the idea of them out of the public's attention. Ivil wasn't a member of the public. When Missy the War Mim led her into a small but comfortably appointed room just past the opening hangar of the ship and turned, she found herself meeting the shorter woman's eyes and wondering if the mime planned on trying to kill her. "So," Missy said as she settled into a relaxed posture, all of her weight on one side, hip cocked. "You planning on paying?" "I never planned not to," Ivil said. "Though we did skip past the bargaining phase. The young miss out there, 26? She doesn't seem entirely financially conscious." Missy sighed, pinched her brows, then nodded. "Yeah, that sounds like her. She'd probably just be happy to have one more person on this rust bucket. Fortunately, she's not first mate. Look, we've got 4 passenger rooms on here, tour kinda shit. One of the good ones is booked. The last isn't cheap." Ivil nodded along. "The university is footing the bill for me. Well, within reason. This isn't the only ship from Ceres heading out towards Jupiter." Missy shrugged. "It's the one you picked, fancy. Besides, there was an exodus around the crevice, if you didn't notice." "With the arrival of that Martian warship?" Ivil asked. "I noticed." "That's good. So you'll understand that, as one of your last remaining options to get to Jupiter, what we charge for a room is entirely reasonable." Ivil held back a smile. It looked like Missy was trying to fleece her, but she was being entirely too honest about it. Maybe that's why the War Mim wasn't on Hamya? Was she too poor at acting for her own good? "Just give me a price," Ivil said. $5,000 for a trip from here to Jupiter." "That seems high," Ivil said. She had only the vaguest notion of what things were worth anymore, but that did seem like it was on the higher end. Missy raised her hands in a what can you do sort of gesture. "It's room and board, and covers the cost of carrying your weight and freight." "My freight is one small bag, a briefcase, and my weight is hardly worth mentioning," Ivil countered. This was amusing. Usually when she wanted something, people gave it to her. Sometimes while screaming for mercy. Missy sniffed. "You're not that thin, fancy." "Evelyn," Ivil said. "And I'll give you 2,005. 2. Fancy? For 2,500 you'll be eating nothing but slop," Missy said. "Now, we're not the best when it comes to food and board, but I'd expect you to want something more than vat-grown veggie substitutes from here to Jupiter." 3,000, Ivil said. "And I expect a fine dining experience like none other." Missy grinned. 4. "Only if you're serving me yourself," Ivil said. "You'd like that," Missy shot back. "Fine. 3,500. Ivil paused, then nodded. 3,500. "And I do expect to get the nicest room on this rust bucket." "Eh? You can't have that one, booked already." "But the second best isn't all that bad." Missy crossed the room and pushed aside a sliding door, revealing that the room continued. It was oddly misshapen, part of it was thin and narrow, then it opened up into a larger space, with ladders leading up to a sitting area above. At a guess, Ivil imagined that this space was what was left after room had been allocated to other necessities in the rear. There was a large entertainment suite to one side, and a pair of couches squeezed into another. A small locker room was off to the left, where someone could get suited up before ducking out of the airlock. Missy went to one wall and opened up a small cubby, then another, then another. "Gimme a minute," Missy said as she continued to root around. There were several small nooks and spaces here. It looked lived in. Is this the main living room? Ivil asked. It's the rear one, Missy replied as she continued the search for something. Main living space is way out front, behind the cockpit. Back here's the med bay, engineering, crew quarters. You'll be staying in the spine. Ah, found you. She shut a thin closet door with a bump of her hip, then sauntered back to Ivil with a small payment machine in hand. First Bank of Mars, right? That's right, Ivil said. Missy turned the machine towards her, and there was a charge pending on it. She read the dusty screen. That's 37. Service charge, Missy said. Ivil rolled her eyes, then tugged out the wallet she'd gotten from Mint. There was a card there that she tapped onto the machine. It took a moment, but eventually beeped. Nice. Welcome on board the Hell Together. Let me show you to your bunk. Missy tossed the reader onto one of the couches, then gestured Ivil after her. They moved through a bulkhead door, then up a steep ramp in a narrow corridor with padded walls. There were handholds all over, for easier motion in zero-gs. This is the spine, Missy said as they reached the top. It cuts across from the rear to the fore. Bit narrow, so if you see someone moving by, just squeeze to the side. I see, Ivil said. How big is the crew on here? It's just 5 of us, Missy said. Me, 2-6, the captain, the navigator, and the muscle. Ivil wondered what she meant by the muscle, but before she could ask, Missy was stopping by a doorway. There were 2 of them facing each other in the middle of the corridor. The one Missy stopped at had what at one point had probably been a large bee stenciled over it. This is yours, Missy said. She tapped a keypad and the door hissed open. You've got your own head and all. Kitchen's at the front, so's the dining room. Not hard to find or anything. Thank you, Ivil said. She ducked into the room, then paused by the entrance. Not that there was much beyond an entrance. The space was cramped, and Ivil could tell that this was very obviously one of the cargo containers held onto the side of the ship, converted into a living space. There was a bed, just barely large enough for 2 and folded up against the wall, a small kitchen next to a washroom that was basically just big enough for someone to stand in. There wasn't much else, actually. An ancient screen was placed against one wall, and there was a small desk squeezed into the last corner. Well, it's certainly comfortable, Ivil said. Yeah, spoken like a ground pounder, Missy said. This is a luxury suite for anyone used to ship life. And it's all yours. Enjoy. She gave Ivil a little salute, then ducked out of the room. The door hissed shut behind her. Ivil tilted her head to one side, listening to what was going on beyond the room. She could clearly hear Missy heading up to the front of the ship while muttering to herself. Weird one. Captain's gonna be happy, that's a hell of a payday. Ivil rolled her eyes. She tossed her bag to one side, then placed her briefcase on the little desk and popped it open to retrieve one of the tablets within. She probably had a few hours alone, which would be a fantastic time to study up on her new identity. It didn't take her long to discover that someone at Mint was thinking ahead and had outlined the cost of a berth on a ship like the Hell Together. I might have overpaid a little, she muttered. Not by too much, but Missy had certainly gotten more than this room deserved. Ivil wasn't sure if the room was even safe. It had that faint smell that came when a space wasn't well shielded. If she were someone who had to worry about radiation, then it might even be a problem in the long term. Ivil checked through the information packet until she discovered a file with all of the information Martian intelligence was able to gather on the crew of the Hell Together. Ivil stared at the file, then hesitated. Did she want to know this, or did she want to form her own opinions? The question worried her for a while,